Hi, welcome to Lesson 4. We're going to be talking about historical sources. We will talk about the difference between a primary and a secondary source because you need to include a primary source in your essay. This lesson refers directly to pages 41 to 48 in the booklet. This particular lesson refers to the last paragraph before the conclusion of your essay. Basically, you can use a discussion of the sources your historians use as a way to analyse which point of view has more validity, okay? And what we mean is, what sources did your historian use to discuss your individual? And if they use sources that are not reliable, that means their perspective on the individual may not be as reliable. Okay? We'll talk a bit about that as we proceed. So today we're going to look at the different types of sources, how to determine which is which and what is what, and what to look for in terms of bias and truthfulness. That's a big one. So there are two types of sources. There are primary sources and secondary sources. In history, primary sources are sources that come from the time of the historical event or from the time of the person you're talking about. So, for example, the birth record of Lenin is a primary source. The diary of Anne Frank is also a primary source because it was written at the time Anne Frank was alive. Other types of primary sources are newspaper accounts, postcards, government records, maps, births, deaths, and marriage records. There are also secondary sources. Secondary sources are sources that were made not at the time they're writing about. So, for example, an historian writing today about Gough Whitlam or Malcolm Fraser or Ned Kelly or Pemulwuy, an author writing today, writing a book about that, they are a secondary source because they were not alive when that person they're writing about was alive. Magazine articles written about events that took place in the past are also secondary sources, and journal articles where academics try to analyse history from a present-day perspective are also a secondary source. Let's look at some examples of sources. So what you're looking at now is a postcard of Charlie Chaplin that was issued by his film studio at the time he was acting. It's a primary source because it is a postcard from the time when Chaplin was a performer. So from this we can see that Charlie wore a specific costume and what he looked like, basically. It's a photo postcard. But we also have to think about who produced this primary source. Now, we know that it was produced by the studio for whom he acted. So you can see that they published this postcard to promote Charlie Chaplin in a positive way. Okay, so even when you're looking at a primary source, you have to look at why it was produced, who produced it, and whether there is a bias attached to it. There's another source about Charlie Chaplin. There's a website, charliechaplin.com. Now, this website was produced after his death, so it's not really a primary source, but it may contain primary sources because it might contain interviews with people who knew Charlie Chaplin, or it might have recordings of Charlie Chaplin from when he was alive. So they would be primary sources in the secondary source. Interesting. So even if we're looking at a primary source or a secondary source, you always have to evaluate the source for bias. And to do this, you ask some questions like who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, or who produced it, when did they produce it and why did they produce it? and you look at what was the audience for that source. So let's look again at the postcard. Who produced the postcard? It was produced by Charlie Chaplin's studio. Why was it produced? To promote Charlie Chaplin movies. When was it produced? In the 1920s or a bit earlier. And who was the audience for it? Well, Charlie Chaplin fans, film goers. It was to encourage people to go and see Charlie Chaplin in the movies. So it might have been a little bit biased because of that. The other source I mentioned was charliechaplin.com. So who produced charliechaplin.com? It was the family and the rights holders of Charlie Chaplin's images and materials and movies. When did they produce it? Well, they're updating it every day, so it's today. Why did they produce it? To promote Charlie Chaplin and his associated material, his movies, his publicity material, also to promote products with Charlie Chaplin on them. And who are the audience? Well, people who like Charlie Chaplin. So if we look at these sources, even though one's a primary source and one's secondary source, both of them are likely to be biased in favour of Chaplin because of the reasons they were produced. That doesn't mean that they're not valid sources of evidence, but whenever you look at evidence and sources in history, you always have to evaluate them in terms of their bias. So you have to be a critical reader and a critical thinker about the things that you look at and use in your essays in history. Okay, so there are really two things to take away from the lesson today. Number one, you need to use a primary source in your essay. You can use the primary source in the historical context paragraph if you want to, or if one of your historians is writing at the same time as your individual lived, that would be a primary source. Okay. And the second part to take away from today is that the sources your historians use can sometimes relate to whether that historian is reliable or not. And generally in history, we consider an historian using primary sources to be more reliable than an historian using secondary sources. So one of the marking criteria is that you must analyse the perspectives of your historians. And one way to analyse the historian's credibility or how good they are or their perspective is to look at what sort of sources the historian is using. Okay? So by the end of this week, I'm hoping that you have chosen your individual and you have done some reading and research about them. You should also be thinking about what historians you are going to use about your individual. Now, I would like you, by the end of this week, to have written a biography paragraph about your individual and an historical context paragraph. Okay, so hopefully you can get something like that done and email it to me, and I'll see if you're on the right track. Now, if you haven't got two perspectives on the individual, when you tell me who your individual is, I have a list in my head, I suppose, about different perspectives about historians who have written about the individual. So, and many of my students have, of course, written about different individuals, and we can use that resource to help you as well. So, by the end of this week, please try and write a biography paragraph about your individual and an historical context paragraph. So they are the first and second body paragraphs of the essay. Okay, they don't have to be perfect. Just send them along to me and I will give you some feedback on that. Okay, thank you. Bye.